Okay, so once again, good morning, everyone. This is Tyler Smith, the University Ombuds at Northeastern Illinois University, and I appreciate everyone being with us. I realize I just said good morning. It's kind of losing track of the time these days. I realize it's afternoon, but thank you for joining. We're going to go ahead and get started. We had over 100 people sign up, so I'm expecting others will chime in, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and there's much content to cover, so we'll go ahead and jump right in. So today's session is going to be about navigating email challenges and conflict. And as the University Ombuds, as someone who provides confidential and informal and impartial and independent services to members of the university community who are interested in navigating and exploring options to address challenging university-related situations, I see a lot of challenges that come up in the way that we use email or other electronic forms of communication. And it's not unique to Northeastern. My time at the National Institutes of Health, I saw a lot of that as well. And in fact, as a result of that, I developed these email workshops and wanted to proactively help people think about some things to consider, some strategies and techniques that can mitigate conflict through email. And so this actually started as like a half-day workshop that had interactive activities and other things. And I've now condensed it to a 1-hour online presentation. So I'm going to try to cover the basics and give out as much information as I can, but there's definitely more to explore on this topic. And if anyone is dealing with a particular situation that they're looking to talk through and navigate and apply some of the strategies that we'll mention today, anyone can reach out to me at any point at the Ombuds office and we can talk. My contact information is going to be at the end of the slides. But before we jump into things, I just want to mention a couple of logistical things so that we can go about this virtual presentation in the most effective way. And then I'll take some time to talk about our agenda for how we'll use the time, and then we'll go ahead and jump right in. So first of all, if anyone else can, or if anyone can just confirm in the chat that you can see my slides, that would be great as well. I just want to make sure that folks have access to that. So those that are on the computer should be able to see my slides. Okay, great. I'm seeing confirmation of that. Wonderful. If you're just joining us by phone and you can't see, but you can hear, that's fine, because as I did in the presentation last week, I will send out a PDF copy of the slides that I use today to everyone who's joining. So whether you're on the computer or on the phone, you will receive a copy of these slides. I also just ask that everybody mutes their microphones so that we can minimize background noise and disruptions. We can utilize the chat as much as possible to ask questions as we go throughout the presentation. So if you have the chat feature, you can send questions through that. I'll try to monitor it as best I can. If you are on the phone and you do have a particular question, you can unmute yourself and chime in, and I'll do my best to address the question, or we can just save it at the end. I've carved out specific time at the end for general questions, either through the chat or through audio. But to the extent that we can mute microphones throughout the way, that would be great. As I mentioned in the last presentation, for those of you that were here, I live off a pretty main road downtown, and I also live a block and a half from the fire department. So if you hear any noises in my background, I do apologize. But in a one-bedroom apartment here, I'm limited on the places that I can go. Also, if you want to keep your video on, that's fine. But also, if you just want to disable it, that's okay too. As I mentioned, we'll utilize the chat feature. The session is going to be recorded. As I did last time, it was nice to be able to provide the session to folks that weren't able to make it by uploading it to YouTube. So I intend to do the same thing this time. So this session is also being recorded. So know that you'll get a copy of the recording, and anyone who wasn't here today will also have access to that as well. And like I mentioned, I'll go ahead and share a PDF copy of the slides to everyone in attendance. So that covers the logistic things, unless anyone has a question that hasn't been covered. Otherwise, we'll jump into talking about how we'll use the time. So I want to spend about 15 minutes just on understanding some aspects of communication in general that then impact how email communication happens and the challenges that they create. We'll also spend a little bit of time on identifying potential controversial email elements. So these are things that over the years in doing this work and presenting workshops like this, I've come to learn can be controversial elements of email, and people may have very different opinions and expectations around them. Then we'll spend some time to explore strategies for preventing, de-escalating, and managing conflict through email. And we'll finish, as I mentioned, with the recap and opportunity for questions. Okay, I'm going to pause for a second. I do see that there is an active mic, and I'm going to go ahead and see if I can mute that. Okay, I think we got it. All right, so that's how we'll use the time, but we'll go ahead and just jump right in. So I think there's a little something that we need to consider from the beginning when we talk about email communication. So there are obviously advantages and limitations to email. It's fast, it's quick, it's convenient. We can do it from wherever we want as long as we have access and connectivity. But it also is, less personal, and we only are able to rely on the written aspect of communication. There's a lot that's left up to misinterpretation, which we'll dig into. But I think there's a larger set of considerations that we can look at, and that is that we rely heavily on email as a form of communication. I think in general, and especially now as we're working and operating and learning and teaching more remotely. Some of the research that's been done just as recent as 2019 shows that on average, about 128 billion with a B emails are sent and received in the business world per day. And that is expected to increase by at least 3% for the next 6 years. So we're just on this trend of using more and more electronic forms of communication, and email, of course, is the classic one. However, we rarely formalize the teaching of email communication or make efforts to establish norms. I'd love to, if I had everybody in the room together, see hands on how many people as they entered the workspace had some sort of formal training about how we use email around here and what the expectations are. Or even just in general, before you enter the workforce, did anyone sit down and really talk to you about some email etiquette or expectations around email? Some might have, and that's wonderful. But most of us haven't really had that. But at the same time, we have these kind of high and sometimes specific expectations of people when they do communicate over email. And so I think we just have to keep that in mind, that we all come from this, maybe from a different place. We're utilizing it a lot. We have different habits, we have different tendencies, we have different preferences, and they may not be shared. And we have to sometimes more explicitly talk about that and talk about our expectations. So I mentioned this just because I think it's an important place to start from for us to just understand that that's kind of in the backdrop here. So then we look at, what are some aspects of just communication in general that really help us to build understanding and participation in dialogue and conversations? I won't dig into the details of all of this. It's not the most interesting thing for some. Others, maybe it is. If you have interest, there will be references at the end of the slide where you can read a little bit more about this. But I think there are just some very basic things that ground our communication. Sometimes it's about just being in the same surrounding, the same environment with the person that we're communicating with, or being able to literally see them, or being able to actually hear the timing of their speech, or to be able to receive an utterance that they make at the same time that they produce it, that there's not any kind of delay. Or maybe it's about being able to send and receive messages simultaneously. So as I'm speaking, you're giving me feedback in your body language or your facial expressions, that we're both sending messages verbally and non-verbally at the same time. Or that there's an ability to kind of have sequence and take turns speaking. Or maybe less in the verbal or oral communication world and more in the written communication world, we have the ability to kind of record messages and review them and go back and process them, make sense of them. Or we maybe have the ability to revise a statement before we send it. So it's not just kind of coming out of our mouth as we think it in a conversation with someone, but we're able to actually write it down, think about it before we send it. So if you look at all of these things that help us to kind of ground communication and build understanding and participation, and you ask yourself, well, of these things, which ones do we get to do in email? It's very little. It's the reviewability, it's the revisability, and sometimes it's the idea of taking turns and the sequentially aspect of it. So, but that's also not perfect. You can certainly kind of email over top of each other, or You can come into an email chain late and you're reading it in reverse order. So you're seeing what was communicated last first, and that can be really confusing. So really, I think the most reliable things are just the reviewability and revisability. So of course, this leaves so much, as we've mentioned before, up to misinterpretation. When we lose all these aspects of communication, it impacts our ability to really understand messages, and it impacts our ability to really participate fully in conversation and dialogue. So again, I think this is just foundational, thinking about like what leads to some of the real challenges that we face in email. There are also other things that the research demonstrates for us, and that is that we often overestimate how well we can communicate by email, or we assume that because we know what we intend to communicate, that the receiver of the message will know as well. And it can be difficult for us to really move beyond our own subjective experience or interpretation of our message and really consider how someone else might evaluate it or how they might draw conclusions based off of it. And some of that has to do with when we're making those determinations, we use ourselves as the main reference point. And of course, we are biased, and we have limitations and blind spots. And so it's unfair for us to use ourselves as a reference point as we estimate how someone else might interpret our message. So we're crafting it. We think it's fine. We think it's great. We think they should understand it perfectly. We send it off, and then we feel shocked and blindsided, confused and surprised and frustrated when they read into it in a very different way. So yes, that happens, but these are some of the reasons why that happens. And you can think about in email communication, we also have different styles. So there's some additional things to consider, like our electronic forms, our e-styles, our electronic communication styles. We all have our general communication styles, but how does that translate into the electronic world? Some it translates pretty closely, that somebody might be direct and pretty blunt, pretty direct, pretty concise in their everyday communication, and that's the way that you experience them in email. But it could be different. Maybe that's how you experience them in person, but they're very expressive in email. They're very lengthy in email, and so there's a disconnect there. There's a difference there. I think it's important to just understand that we all have these different styles, how expressive we are. Sometimes I hear it described as bluff versus fluff. So bluff is bottom line up front, kind of get to the point. What do I need to know? It's actually a military term that's used. And then also there's the fluff, which is like someone provides more context, more kind of emotional tone to their email. They might start off by asking how the person's doing. How was your weekend? Hope you're doing well, those kinds of things. Where the bottom line up front person would say, there's no need for that. It's a waste of time. This is about efficiency. This is why I use email in the first place. And so just give me the information that I need, or I'm going to give you the information that you need and nothing else. So we see these different styles and how they interact with one another, and the kind of challenges and conflict that can even create, especially if we have different styles. So I ask people, do you know your own style, especially when it comes to electronic forms of communication? Are you more direct in your communication with others electronically? Are you more expressive? And why is that? And do people know about that? Not just through their experience, but they know, have you explicitly stated that? Could you talk about your style and why it's important to you, and why do you utilize that style? And also, can you ask yourself, how does my style impact others? So if I'm someone who's the bottom line up front person, and I think it's about efficiency and effectiveness and saving time, but it's coming across to others as blunt, terse, disrespectful, even offensive, overbearing, I don't know, the list goes on, then are you aware of that? Do you know that that's how it comes across? And are there things that can be done to kind of create better understanding and mitigate the impacts of some of that? Sometimes it's just about awareness. And then also we have to think about, and I mentioned this in my last presentation as it relates to communication in general, and especially working remotely, that we all have different skills, abilities, and preferences when it comes to email communication. So not everyone kind of grew up using email as a primary form of communication, where others did. And so their skill level might be pretty high, even if you just think from like a typing standpoint, that they can, pretty quickly draft a lengthy message and send it off, and it doesn't take a lot of their time. But somebody else that might take a fair amount of time for them. Or you just think about written communication skills in general, and how everyone's kind of at a different place on that. And just abilities to use technology, and how that factors in, and navigating kind of the Google platform or Outlook or whatever it might be, and just understanding the different elements of email communication and how to utilize them, how to use attachments, how to use links in email, all of that. We just have to be mindful of the differences that we have there. I'll tell a very quick story that helped me on this point. A while ago, I worked for a boss who I actually was an intern, and I was working on a specific project for him. And I spent like my entire morning one day giving this entire update about a project that I was working on. And I broke it down in these nice, neat paragraphs, and I had things organized really well, and some links, and a copy of a document that I was working on attached, all sorts of things. I was really proud of the message. It took a lot of time. I reviewed it, I revised it, I sent it. And the reply that I received was, okay. And I just remember feeling crushed in that moment, like, okay, what does that mean? How do I make sense of that? And that's all. And I was expecting so much more, and I just felt really kind of uncomfortable in the moment, not sure how to make sense of that. And of course, my mind was going to kind of the worst case scenario, like, he doesn't like it, it doesn't make sense, he doesn't approve of it, he's not excited about it, or whatever. Long story short, later on that day, I saw him in the hallway, and he was like, hey, I saw your email. I'm really excited about some of the things that you're doing. Do you have some time later? We could talk in more detail about it. And I said, yeah, sure. So we set up some time after lunch. And I came in, and he started to give me all this feedback and started to talk about it. And it was clear that he had really read it and taken it into consideration. So I was already starting to reshape some of my assumptions that I was making about the okay message. But then there was a moment in the meeting where he said, hey, there's this article that I want to give you that I think could really help you with some of the work that you're doing. Do you mind if I just take a second to try to pull it up? And I said, sure. And so he rolled over to his desk from the table we were meeting at, and he opened up his internet browser, and he started to type into Google the title of this article. And he was hunting and picking, if you know that strategy, on the keyboard. And it took about maybe 2 minutes to kind of get the entire article title out. And it was in that moment that I realized, okay, this makes sense. For him to sit there, this was a very busy man, had a lot going on, a lot of different competing priorities. And this probably wasn't high on the list. For him to sit there and to reply to my lengthy email in great detail, responding to all of the different points that I made, would have taken way more time than he actually had. And so he tended to be a lot shorter in his email communication. It was about just efficiency and time for him. And it had to do with his level of skills and abilities which he was not afraid to admit and was okay and comfortable with, and wasn't planning on changing anytime soon as he was approaching the end of his career. And so it was a real moment for me, because from that point on, I started to renegotiate my expectations about how email communication would happen with him. And in fact, the majority of our communication from that point on really happened in-person, face-to-face meetings, and I relied a lot less on email communication. So I use the time to share that story because I think it does illustrate not just styles, but also skills, abilities, and preferences when it comes to email communication. And we might make some really strong assumptions about that that could in fact be wrong in terms of where it's actually coming from. Okay, let's see. So also culture. And I mean that in an individual and organizational way. So we all have kind of individual cultural backgrounds that influence the way that we communicate in general, and it can certainly influence electronic forms of communication. One example that comes to mind for me around this that I saw a lot at the NIH and working with people from all around the world was sometimes in email communication, people could literally interpret the words for what they literally mean and not understanding the kind of the context and other like language factors around that. I'm by no means an expert in that, so I'm probably not using the right terms. But a quick example is that a principal investigator of a lab once was having a postdoctoral fellow come from overseas to work into the lab, and he ended an email by saying, "We can't wait to have you here." And the person immediately called and was in tears because they interpreted that literally. They thought that they meant, "We cannot wait to have you here." And so the opportunity no longer exists. If you can't come now, then it's not going to happen. When of course, what they meant was, "We can't wait, we're excited, we're really happy about this." And so because the person interpreted the message literally, it crushed them and it impacted them in a very different way. So we have to be mindful of some of those challenges around language, also challenges around culture. And this could be organizational culture too, in terms of, I mentioned earlier, coming from a military culture, not me personally, but if someone is, and they're used to that bottom line upfront communication, that just seems like is about efficiency and isn't necessarily disrespectful, and they're communicating with other colleagues who don't come from a culture like that, there may be a challenge there. There may be some friction there. Maybe the new organizational culture, the new office is not like that. Maybe people are more expressive in emails. Maybe more information and lengthy information is shared in email. So I hope you're getting the point in terms of just thinking about how individual and organizational culture and also language challenges might come into play. Now, people always say, "Yeah, well, these challenges exist, but what if you have a good relationship with the person, or there's a level of familiarity, and so you know each other's styles?" Well, yes, of course, those are certainly mitigating factors. Those will decrease the likeliness of there being misinterpretation or assumptions or misunderstandings. And so the better we can form relationships, form understanding about people's styles, get familiar with them, understand their preferences for communication, negotiate expectations, the less of these challenges will really come into play. And of course, the context matters as well. Like, what is the situation that we're communicating about? And if it's just a simple back and forth exchange, some of this might really not come into play. But if there's, a critical issue that we're trying to navigate or trying to figure out, or in these times of remote communication, we're trying to send updates and get feedback and connect people together and share information, that some of these challenges absolutely can come up, and we need to be mindful of that. Okay, so I just want to pause real quick and check in to see if anyone on the chat or by audio has any kind of quick questions about anything that I've mentioned thus far before we move into the other portions. Okay, I'm not seeing anything on the chat. Thank you, Mike, though, for the feedback. Okay, so I'll move forward. Like I said, I'll create some time at the end for us to pause and have room for questions. Okay, so I don't have the time that I would like to go into all of these in great detail, which we certainly could, and I'm sure that everyone has a story about at least something, if not a lot of things on this list. I want to present it because, like I said in the beginning, just over time and doing this work and also doing these workshops with hundreds and hundreds of people from all different offices and departments and functions and roles, I've learned a lot myself about the kinds of things that people might find controversial about emails. And so I want to present you with a list. I'll talk through a couple of the examples, and at the end, if people have questions about more of them, we can certainly talk about them. But I just want people to have this as a reference so that you can be thinking about how you might use some of these things and whether or not they're coming across in the way that you intend. So there's everything from just how we use greetings and closings, how we start emails, whether we say hi, hello, good evening, good afternoon, dear, greetings. You'd be surprised at how much that sets the tone and how much that matters for people, especially if there's none used at all. I certainly have heard people say that feels very offensive to just go right into an email and not have any kind of greeting. And I've certainly heard other people say, like, that's not so important and I don't really have all the time for that. I just want to be able to get my statement across, and that's what matters most. And I hope people aren't offended by that. I've been in a session before where there was a 10 to 20 minute debate about the difference between hi and hello and how it comes off for people and the differences in formality around that. So I say this not to cause you to overthink it too much, but just be aware that there are different preferences that people have around these things, and we might be surprised at how they come across. So again, everything from greetings and closings to how we use like read receipts to confirm that people have gotten our messages, There are, of course, people in roles that have very good reason for that because they have to document rigorously things, but other times people are using it because it's about an issue of trust that's not explicitly stated. And so maybe there needs to be a conversation about that or about responsiveness to emails or follow through with emails instead of just trying to use a technical feature to be able to address that, which may cause further damage. Of course, the use of CC and BCC and forwarding. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into some of the strategies, how attachments are used or importance, high importance notices or flags. Of course, the formality of our communication. Sometimes people can feel really bothered when it's treated as more of like a messaging or a texting kind of thing, and they expect more formality in email and more kind of professionalism, so to speak. And then other people are completely comfortable with being informal in email. Some of this does have to do with like the relationships that you already have with people and the familiarity. Structure is a big one. Do I have just one running paragraph of things, or am I breaking it up into different paragraphs or different bullet points that is more digestible? Length is, of course, a huge one. The difference in the example I said earlier of just saying okay or thanks versus actually providing more detail, more context, what you're thanking the person for, what you find to be okay. Replying to someone directly versus replying all, and the challenges that exist around that. Signature blocks, of course, just what's included in them. Everything from like, is the information accurate? Is it too much or too little information? Or is it like people have different feelings and thoughts about inspirational quotes and how they might come across to people? Or sometimes I've seen them used to send, passive messages in certain ways, which people can feel off-put or offended by. So there's a lot, and there's a whole nother list here, as you can imagine. The use of capital letters, the use of different adjustments to our fonts or bold or underline or highlights, emojis, spelling and grammar, punctuation, abbreviations, automatic replies. There's a lot of that going on right now as people are giving notices of working remotely. I certainly have picked up on that myself. Again, that's like signature blocks, everything from like what's in them to whether or not people feel like they're appropriate to whether the information is accurate or helpful, or whether it's necessary at all. And a big one is response time expectations. Sometimes I've heard people say within 24 hours is a reasonable time to get back to people by email. Beyond that, the person is okay to have concerns and to be frustrated. And other people are saying 24 hours is really unrealistic. I get 7,000 emails a day and I have to go through them and prioritize them. I might send you a message that just says that I've at least received it, but I might not be able to provide much more than that. So there's all these differences and expectations around response time. And if we're having ongoing email working relationships with people, we can be more clear about what those are and why they're important, how they fit and or meet the needs that we have. So again, I wish we could dive into this a lot further because like I said, I'm sure everyone has some sort of story or experience or maybe even question with one of these. We'll save some time at the end if people do, but I just want people to be more mindful of how some of these might come across. And a simple thing that you can do is you can just ask people. You can ask people who you work with or email with on a regular basis that you maybe use some of these elements, like, if they come across in a particular way or if people are okay with them or not. You can just have those conversations, outside of the context of an actual issue or controversy over email. Okay, so we've talked about that. We've kind of talked about aspects of email or communication in general, how they impact email in particular, how they lead to some of the challenges. We've talked about some of these controversial elements. So the rest of the presentation, leading up to just a space for questions, I'm going to talk about some kind of core strategies for initiating emails and then responding to problematic emails. Like the choice between whether you respond by email or in some other way. And then if you actually do choose to respond by email, what are some things to consider there? So as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, this went from a half-day workshop that I used to do to a 1-hour online presentation. So there's going to be a lot of content here. I'm going to try to go through it as best I can and kind of provide some context around it. But if I'm not able to touch on everything in great detail, just know that you'll have the slides as a reference, and that if at any point you're interested in more information or additional thoughts or perspective on anything that I just mentioned, please feel free to reach out to me at any point. I'd be happy to provide some more information. Okay, so let's get started with that. So I mentioned initiating emails. These are situations when you are the one crafting the original email. And I think a lot of what I'm going to talk about might apply to situations where you don't already have some sort of familiarity with other people. Maybe you're sending a large email to a large group of people where you don't know everybody so well, but it also could be, an email that you're sending to someone that you do have some sort of ongoing working relationship with, or a teacher or a student of some sort. So I'm going to just flash them all up here and go through them. The first thing I think is important to consider is your message or the situation in general that you're trying to communicate about suitable for email? And just upfront being very honest with ourselves of why I'm choosing to use email. Am I choosing to use email because it is convenient? It's not a pressing situation where I feel like I need some of those other social cues that come along with face-to-face or video or phone communication. It is just for the sake of informing someone, sharing information. And I do think that it's fine for email. People can review it at their convenience. I don't need immediate feedback. And so I'm going to go forward with email. But maybe you're saying, like, I'm doing this by email because it's more comfortable for me. And I'm not saying that that's not okay, but I would ask someone in a situation like that more questions, like, where is the discomfort coming from? Is it just that you feel like you have better skill in writing than communicating orally, and so that you feel like you can convey your message in a different way via email? That might be okay. But maybe it's like, there's this tension, there's this already kind of brewing conflict with this person, and there's been interpersonal problems in the past, and it's just more comfortable for me in a disconnected way to be able to communicate with them. So I think in those situations, again, not saying that that's not okay, but I think there's some things that could be explored that might instead make you feel more comfortable in communicating with something other than email. You don't just have to resort to email as an option just because it makes you feel more comfortable. So I think that question is critical at the beginning. And then there are some basic things that we could be thinking about in general in our communication, but specifically apply to email, like, what is your purpose? And how will that influence your approach? Is your purpose to just inform people? Is your purpose to get some sort of feedback? Is your purpose for somebody to actually take action on something for you? Is your purpose to be able to get information from someone else that will then allow you to move forward with something? Regardless of what the purpose is, I think it definitely is important to identify so that it can then start to shape your approach to the actual email in terms of formality, in terms of structure, in terms of context, all of these things. In addition to purpose, it's important to think about, who is my audience? What is my relationship with this person? What is their role? Who are they? What's their personality? What's their communication style? And how will that influence my approach to this email for them? Again, in terms of formality, in terms of style. We can also think about specific techniques. This is one that I love, that I've started practicing over the last year, is to the extent that I can remember to do it, which is the order of completion of the email. So starting with the body of the email first, like what you actually write, and then going back and creating your subject line so that it accurately reflects what it is that you actually wrote. And then the last thing that you do is who it's to, or who you might CC or BCC. That way you prevent yourself from sending out an email prematurely, or sending it to the wrong person, or creating a subject line that then ends up not actually reflecting what's in the body of the email itself, which can cause frustrations, as we saw on the other slide. And so just thinking about how that order can help you from making mistakes, or helping you to convey the kind of message that you want to. Speaking of subject lines, the research shows that the more clear and specific we are in our subject lines, the more likely that people are going to be to click on that email, to open it up, to review it, and most importantly, to respond to it if that's something that's required. So we should think about how we can actually accurately match the subject line with the email. This is something that I struggle with all the time. Sometimes I spend more time than is ever necessary thinking about just what the subject line is going to be to the email. But sometimes that's okay. That's important to take that time. We also know that if there is an action item that you're requesting in the email, that if you actually put that request in the subject line, that's important. So like if you're trying to set up a meeting with someone, you can say like, setting up meeting 4, scheduling meeting 4, confirming meeting 4, like whatever that actually is, that action item, as opposed to just saying meeting time or something more general. We can also, like I said on the other slide, the greetings are so important. So we should be thinking about, depending on who our audience is, what our purpose is, what our relationship is with them, what's an appropriate greeting? Does it have to be something more formal or more informal? Do we need a greeting at all? Do we know the other person's preferences and how that might come across to them? This is an important one here about being transparent with CC or read receipt, but I'll focus mainly on CC. I always think about, if I'm CCing somebody on a message, can I be transparent up front in the beginning of the message about, 1, the fact that I'm doing that, and 2, why? So just saying I'm copying so-and-so and so-and-so on this email because I think it's important for them to have the information as they're part of this project as well. I think just doing that, being transparent about that, can minimize the likeliness that people misinterpret your reasoning for doing that, and expanding kind of the scope of who's involved in the conversation. I'm not saying that this will be required every time if there's already like expectations that certain people will be CC'd on things, but if this is something new, being clear about that up front can go a long way for preventing further kind of conflict or misunderstandings or misinterpretations. I think we can also think about, do we need to introduce ourselves if it's somebody that we've never met? I used to run this activity in the workshop where I would ask people to write an email as if they were emailing somebody that they didn't know for the first time about setting up a meeting for something. And it was amazing to see the different approaches that people took and how half of the room would not introduce themselves at all. Another group of people would introduce themselves just a little bit. Other people would give some significant background about who they are and why they're emailing. But just asking yourself, is it important for me to introduce myself? And in addition to that, like how much context do I need to provide about why I'm reaching out, why I'm emailing in the first place? Some other things to consider. Formatting, we talked about that earlier. What kind of formatting will make it visually appealing and easily kind of digestible as somebody receives it and reads it? Are we being clear about our purpose, our desired outcome, and any kind of next steps that we need to clarify if it's an email that, that warrants that? Just like the greeting, are we determining appropriate closing? We've had many conversations about that too, about how you kind of sign off. Is it thank you? Is it thank you so much? Is it have a great day? Is it best? Is it all the best? Is it cheers? Whatever it might be. We all have different preferences and approaches, but just be thinking, I think it's important to think explicitly about how it might come across. Circling back and asking yourself, after you've done all of this, kind of, could my message be interpreted in a way that I do not intend? Taking all the things that we talked about earlier into consideration. And if so, why? And what adjustments could I make in order to convey a desired tone or convey the kind of message that I'm intending to? One way that you can do this is you can get somebody else, like a trusted colleague, to review the message and say, hey, how does this come across to you? How would you interpret this? How would you read this? Are there any adjustments that you think I could make? And of course, you can tell them from the beginning, this is what I'm intending to do. This is my purpose. This is what I want to convey. Of course, checking your message for spelling, grammar, and punctuation can be important. Asking yourself, if my message isn't understood in the way that I intend, or it's misinterpreted, what am I prepared to do? Will I pick up the phone at that point? Will I decide that there needs to be another way of communicating? Or will I simply just try to kind of clarify through email and allow myself like we talked about, or I talked about in my last presentation, the 3 email rule. If we go back and forth 3 times and it's not resolved, then I'll pick up the phone. But just be thinking in advance, like what are you prepared to do if it doesn't land in the way that you intend? And then I think this is important to still ask yourself at this point, like, should I still send an email? Is email still the most appropriate way of communicating? Is there something else, like picking up the phone or scheduling a meeting or a video call, that I should do instead after you've done all this work? You might still feel like, okay, I'm going to move forward with it, and that's fine. But just that extra check-in, I think, can be important after you've done all of this work. This last piece that I want to mention is after you've sent it, a lot of times we kind of establish the expectations, we establish the norm ourselves from the bat about, from the get-go about how we are going to communicate, how we're going to use greetings, how we're going to use structure, length, formality, all of those kinds of things. And then what we can do is, depending on how the person replies to us, we can kind of use mirroring techniques. If they reply, without a greeting and a level of informality, and that's okay. Maybe we mirror that in our response, that we don't continue to keep it as formal. But if you're somebody who just believes in consistency and you want to go forward with things regardless, that's okay too. But this mirroring technique I've heard come up many, many times, and a lot of people seem to take advantage of that. It seems to help kind of manage expectations and minimize assumptions from the beginning, but then being willing to adjust them as the conversation unfolds. Especially if you've never had a conversation with someone, you don't really even know them. They're this person that you haven't even put really a face to the name, but you email with, you'll be emailing with regularly. You haven't had a conversation about styles, expectations. This is a way to kind of gauge that as you go. Okay. So then that's initiating emails. Now we have receiving problematic emails. I think we've all at some point been on the receiving end of an email that causes us to have a less than favorable reaction. Maybe we feel immediately surprised or blindsided or caught off guard or frustrated or defensive or offended or disrespected or confused, whatever it is. And we want to know, how do we move forward with engaging with this? So these are some things to consider. Again, I know it's a lot. First, kind of just resisting the urge to reply in that reactive way. I think we hear this a lot, really taking the time to step back, give yourself some space, give yourself some time to reflect. I work solo now as an office of one, so I don't get to take advantage of this. But when I used to work in an office of 7, we kind of had this agreement between those of us that were close to each other that if someone received an email and we just heard them make an audible noise like, oh, or gosh, something like that, and then we immediately heard their fingers on the keyboard, we would just kind of check in with one another and say like, hey, might want to take a second, step back, or just write the draft that you want to say, save it, and come back to it later. We kind of kept each other in check with that. So if you're working close to colleagues, I know that's difficult now, or maybe you're in the household with someone who can provide that check for you. But when you get back to the office, you can create kind of a shared understanding among colleagues or whoever it might be around that. I thought that worked out pretty well for us. It saved me many times. But giving yourself that space, like go take a walk, grab a coffee, whatever you need to do, just to, like, kind of give yourself some space to step back, to de-escalate. Ask yourself these kind of reflective questions. How did that land with me? And what do I think is contributing to that? What do I think the sender's true intent was? Am I making assumptions about that intent? And if so, how can I test them? This is another opportunity where you can ask a trusted colleague to provide some feedback and to give you an idea of how it comes across to them. But I also want to be careful about that. Of course, that's different from just gossiping and saying like, hey, you want to see this email that so-and-so sent me? Isn't it terrible? Or just going to someone who is going to confirm your perspective because they like you and they always agree with you. That's different from someone who you can go to, that you can trust to kind of give some neutral feedback, who can even give you a very different perspective than what you originally had. And I'll just say that this is a role that I often play for people. So if you can't find that person otherwise regularly, then you can always reach out to me and I can give perspective on something like that. And then if you just kind of set aside the sender's delivery, like how they actually crafted the message and how off-put you feel by it, or disturbed or defensive or whatever, and you just think about what is their core message. At the end of the day, what are they really trying to say? I think that can be important to identify. And we'll talk about in a minute, if you decide to reply, how you use that. But just kind of stripping through the delivery and thinking about what's at the core of this, what are they trying to convey, even if I disagree with it or feel offended or off-put by it. What response options do you have? Of course, you can reply by email, but we should be thinking about all of the other options, whether it's picking up the phone or scheduling some sort of video meeting, or in the future, a face-to-face meeting, some way of replying and responding in a way that doesn't just continue the email chain. Could be important to think about for many of the reasons that we talked about earlier. And then just really asking yourself, is the email response necessary and why? And checking your motivation for it, checking your purpose. If it's like, I just want to continue to keep a paper trail because this is ridiculous and I'm not going to tolerate that, that may be a fair concern or fair kind of approach, but is it going to lead to de-escalation? Is it going to lead to a better path forward? Or is that just going to potentially make the situation worse? Or are you, again, just replying because it feels more comfortable for you than having the tough conversation with the other person over the phone, or being able to talk through like why you interpreted in the way that you did and check in about what their intent maybe was. So really just checking your motivation and purpose and weighing out what's the risk of responding by email in terms of potential escalation versus the benefits of just calling or meeting in person or through video. Again, just really being explicit about, do I need to reply by email? Is there a better way? I used to say when I did these workshops regularly that it's ironic that the session about email is basically the main message is know when not to use email. And that's still true here. I think that's just really important to know the limitations and understand how they can contribute to further problems and escalation if we continue to communicate in that way. But let's say you, at the end of the day, you feel like your motivation is pure. You just want to respond in a way to acknowledge that core message and to ask them to set up a time to talk further about it by phone. You feel like your motivation and intention is pure, it's constructive, and you do want to respond by email. So then I think, again, this kind of mirrors in a way the initiating email slide. You kind of come back to, all right, what is my purpose and my goal? What am I really hoping to achieve? What approach is going to allow me to do that? How can I take that approach and focus on preventing further escalation of this situation? How much of the original email do I really need to address? Maybe I do just address that core message like, hey, John, it sounds like you have a lot of concerns about how things are moving forward with the project. Maybe we can think about a time to set up a phone conversation to talk about that in greater detail. There's some things that I want to mention as well. And I'm also, I'm confused by some of the things that I read in this original message, and I just want to be able to clarify. You're just hitting that kind of core piece. That's all. You're not going into the details of the back and the forth of the rest of the message. And then again, ask yourself, who is the other person? Do you know anything about their style? Do you know anything about their approach? Do you know anything about their general way of communicating and how that might influence your approach and how that might lead to the way that they interpret, in turn, your reply? Can you, in your reply, acknowledge that core message? I just gave an example of that. How might the other person, really asking, interpret the message if you review it from their perspective, if you kind of put yourself in their shoes? Maybe you think about somebody who, is in a high-paced environment where there's a lot going on, and they may be feeling overwhelmed, they may be feeling stressed, they may be getting a lot of emails on a regular basis and trying to manage that and trying to prioritize that. If you can put yourself in that position and think about your reply, how might you interpret it? How might it come across to you? And then, of course, do you need to make some adjustments in order to convey a more desirable tone or to convey a different kind of message that's more in line with what your intentions are? Maybe you have to be explicit about your intentions in the beginning. Like, I don't want to create a back and forth by continuing the email. I really want to just be able to get to an understanding about how we move forward with this initiative that we're working on. And I have some concerns about where we are right now, and I have some questions about the information that I've received in this email. And so I just want to be able to set up a meeting so that we can reach a place of greater clarity. That you're just being explicit about what your intentions are from the beginning. You're being transparent about that. I think the CC rule applies here as well. So if you're tempted to expand the scope and copy more people into the conversation at this point, which is a temptation that we often have. I want to CC someone else so that they see what's going on here, so that they're informed, so that they can make their own judgment of how, off-putting this original email was, or so that they can, hold the person accountable to responding to me, whatever it might be. Can you be transparent and upfront about your reasoning for CCing at that point too? And if the answer is no, then I would just ask you to really question whether or not it's important to still CC. Because If you're not open and transparent, it does leave it up for interpretation, and that can often lead to another issue now that the person feels concerned or bothered by. And so if you can be transparent and say, I'm also copying so-and-so because I think it's important for them to have information around this too, and they might have some questions about this, or they might be able to provide greater clarity, then that's okay. But if you're just CCing them because you think that they're more likely to help hold you accountable and you don't feel comfortable in being transparent about that, then maybe you choose not to CC. Maybe there's another way to loop that person into the communication, or maybe it's not important at all at that point. So again, every situation is going to be unique and require different kind of judgments and different considerations. But I'm just thinking as a general rule, think about, can you be transparent about your reasoning for CCing? And if so, maybe it's important to be explicit about that from the beginning of your reply. Okay, I want to just check real quick. I saw something come through on the chat. I want to make sure I'm not ignoring that. Okay, I'm going to save that. Thank you, Joseph, for the question. I'm going to save that for just a moment when we get to just general questions. That's the first one that I will answer. Okay, so the last thing I want to mention on this slide is just circling back at the end, reviewing your reply. You feel like it's coming from a good place of motivation, a good intention. You're clear about your purpose. You're just addressing the kind of core message. You're not going into all the details. You've put yourself in their shoes and considering from their perspective how they might interpret it. You're thinking about how your tone's coming across. You've been transparent about your intent and maybe even CCs. Just really, again, asking yourself, does the approach that you've taken here work towards achieving that original goal? Are you being honest with yourself? Do you feel like it really is going to lead to a better path forward, lead to de-escalation, prevent further conflict, gain clarity, or do you think that it still has the potential to be problematic? And if that is the case, then maybe, again, it's time at that point to say, okay, you know what, I'm just going to pick up the phone. I'm going to find another way to convey this message that may be more effective. Or if you feel comfortable with it, then maybe it's time to go ahead and hit send. But before you do that, you can also always, as we mentioned before, but on the back end, ask that same or a different trusted colleague, here's how I've replied. Here's what my intention is in replying. Can you review this and give me some feedback? Give me your thoughts. But again, being aware of and conscious of kind of who you go to for that feedback is really important. Not just somebody who's going to say, yeah, no, that's great, and agree with you because they always do. Somebody who's you can trust to kind of give that honest feedback, even if it's disagreeing with you in a way. I've taken it, I used to, less now, but I used to, when I worked with other colleagues, take advantage of this all the time, and it saved me so many times. And there were times where I was so committed to an email. I had worked so hard of going through all of these things and figuring out how to reply. And after I talked to that trusted colleague, they convinced me, like, just pick up the phone. Just pick up the phone and have that conversation. And I'm grateful because I often followed through with that, if not always, and it ended up being a better result. Or they just gave me feedback about the original email and said, I don't know that this is going to come across in the way that you intend, or I think you've been too long-winded here, Tyler, as you tend to be, which is probably no surprise to anyone at this point. And so maybe there's less that you can say that is more impactful. So take advantage of that. Take advantage of the opportunity to get feedback from people that you trust. And like I said, if you're not sure of who to turn to that you already know in your office or in your class or in your department or whatever it might be, then feel free to reach out to me at any point. I'd be happy to kind of walk through those discussions with anyone. Okay, so that brings us to recapping questions. So there's a lot there. We talked about, again, general communication, some of the things that ground our communication and create understanding and participation, and how we lose so much of that in email and how that leads to challenges and how we're often more confident than we probably should be and how well we can convey messages in email, or we assume that other people are interpreting them in the way that we intend and they're not. We've talked about differences in style and preferences and skills and abilities and cultural challenges and language challenges a lot. We've talked about some potential controversial elements of email, and we've talked about some strategies or some reflective questions for initiating emails, dealing with a problematic email, and then the choice of actually responding to email, some things to consider there. So I'm hoping that there was something in this that was helpful for you, especially as we're relying so much on this form of communication right now. But I do want to take some time. We have 5 minutes at least left for questions. And so I'm going to go ahead and start with Joseph sent a question, which is, isn't it considered yelling when you respond in bold, larger letters and or in all capital letters? So it's a great question. In all the time that I've done this, the majority of people that I've talked to or interacted with in this kind of a setting have talked about how they do interpret capital letters as some sort of heightened volume in someone's voice or yelling in some way. That capital letters can often be interpreted in that way. But I have heard differences around bold. A lot of times people will bold things just because they think like, if there's nothing else that you get from this message, I want you to at least see this. Or I know that you have a lot going on and a lot of emails coming through. And so if you open this up, I just want you to capture this portion of it. Or if I'm replying and I felt like something wasn't understood last time, I really want to emphasize it here because it seemed like it was missed before. So it's less yelling. It's more just placing an emphasis. And I think the context matters, of course, right? So if there's already a charged situation, there's tension, that those things can easily be interpreted in that way. But if there is like a sense of familiarity and there's not really a critical issue at play or a conflict that already exists, then those things can be harmless. Or I don't want to say harmless, but they may not be interpreted in those ways. However, I want to emphasize that I have heard pretty repeatedly and regularly that capital letters do come across in that way. In fact, when I was at the NIH, I had someone come into my office and sit an email down on my desk from their colleague and push it over and say, see how they were yelling at me? And it was a message in all caps. And they said, I responded, I said, you have no right to yell at me. So I always think of that situation when it comes to capital letters, because a lot of times it is interpreted in that way. Okay, great question. I think the bottom line is that it really depends. Okay, so there's a lot of questions coming in. I'm going to try to address them as best I can. Okay, can you please talk about being careful about emails and FOIA? Yeah, great question. So one thing that I regret that I didn't mention already, but it is a part of the other presentation, we have more time, is just talking about one of the challenges with email or benefits, it really depends on how you look at it, is once it's out there, it's out there. So I think we should all just know that we should not have expectations of confidentiality in our email. If we're using email, then that we should expect that most likely can be accessed by anyone, whether they're at the university or beyond through some sort of Freedom of Information Act request. And so, of course, there are some exceptions to that, but most situations wouldn't apply. And so just knowing that if you send it out there in email, it can easily be accessed. And also when you send it out there in email, we lose control over it. If you receive a message, anyone can forward that to anyone else. And so we should always be thinking about this message, how will it come across, and what am I saying to the person that I intended to go to? But if anyone else were to get a hold of this, how might they look at it? How might they understand it? What kind of sense would they make from it? So those things are definitely important to take into consideration. I appreciate you bringing it up, Mike. Okay, Laura, how would you address a problematic email where a number of people were CC'd? And would you recommend just responding to the sender to everyone on the original, I think, as opposed to everyone on the original email? I think, again, it really depends on the situation and who's involved. I hate to keep saying that, but there's, different characteristics of each situation that would factor into this. But I think a lot of times, if you feel like it is just something, there's some sort of misunderstanding between two people, that taking that offline, having that conversation and coming back to the group and then clarifying and like helping people to understand how that impacts things can be really important, as opposed to keeping everyone else kind of in the loop with that and impacting the feelings that people have about kind of privacy and confidentiality, or just other people feeling frustrated because they're getting bombarded with this constant chain of emails that they don't feel like they have any part of. So yes, I think there are times where taking it offline can really be beneficial, and maybe even taking it offline and outside of email, as we talked about earlier. But there may be other times that if other people that are CC do have like important opinions around that, or important perspectives or considerations, and they might even be able to help with clarifying some of the misunderstanding or problems, that maybe you kind of keep them included. But there also may be times where you just say, can we all take this conversation offline and have just a meeting or some other discussion about it? That might be important too. It's a great question, Laura. I think there are a lot of different factors to consider there. Okay, more questions are coming in. When there is no reply to an email that needs a reply, I try to politely say an email that the reply needed by specific date to have a specific action done. Very difficult to keep track of an email that is not getting a reply. Is it okay then to say if there is no reply, then action cannot be taken? Okay, so I think this gets to the issue of kind of responsiveness in emails. And I think more often than not, the answer to that is, and we can, to an extent, as you've indicated, Angela, like try to adjust the way that we interact through the email mechanism in order to increase responsiveness and action. And if we get to a point where our best efforts on that have not led to any different result, I think what we need to do is think about how the conversation gets taken offline. We have more of a conversation with that person about responsiveness and expectations around that and the challenges that you're facing. And that gets into a whole nother workshop kind of about those conversations in conflict or difficult conversations. Many of the techniques that I talked about in my session last week would apply to a situation like that. But I think we have to understand where we're limited and how much we can kind of negotiate or impact through changes that we make in the email process. And we have to just take it off and say, I'm having some challenges recently. I've needed a couple of things back and I'm not getting the responsiveness, and it's preventing me from being able to move forward with some of the things that I need to do. I understand you might have a lot going on, or maybe there's a misunderstanding about what I need. And so can we talk about moving forward the best way to coordinate in that way? All right, let's see. I use bold to make sure that students see certain instructions for completing requirements. Yes, so that's another situation where context would matter, and basically it's trying to place emphasis on something so that people, again, like if you see nothing else, make sure that you're getting this, like this date, this deadline, whatever it might be, that makes sense. A lot of people use that. Let's see if there's a couple more. I italicize instead of bolding just to avoid misinterpretation. That can be that's a strategy as well, to put emphasis on something, but not in that kind of bold way that might be interpreted differently. Let's see. What is your thought on writing, please confirm receipt of this email? I think that's okay. I think it gets to just being clear about what you're asking for and kind of managing expectations. And maybe that is the kind of thing that you want to put kind of up front. But there also could be some context to add around that. Like it may just be that there may be some need to provide some reasoning for why that's important. I'm not saying that every situation will call for that, but just so that it's not misinterpreted as like you don't trust me to actually read or review your emails or respond, and so you're requiring that. Just so it's not interpreted in that way. Maybe it's please confirm receipt because it's important to know that you got this information so that we can move forward with something, or it's important because we're keeping track of who has been informed, or whatever. Like if there's some context to provide to a statement like that, that can go a long way for mitigating misinterpretations or minimizing, I should say. But again, it may not be required. I think it's an okay strategy. What are your thoughts on thank you emails where the only text in the body of the email is thank you? Is it necessary? Oh, this is a great question. This comes up a lot. I've heard very different perspectives on this. I was actually just before I left the NIH, this was one of the last workshops that I did, and there was a gentleman in the workshop who said, I cannot stand when I'm just sending basically an FYI email that somebody replies and says thank you. I have enough emails coming in. I don't need your email that just says thank you. You can save it. So obviously people have some strong opinions about that. I think that as the sender of the email, we have a big responsibility in that. So I think if you're somebody who does not want that, like you would prefer people not to crowd your inbox with thank yous, but you're sending out information to inform people, that you can maybe be explicit and say, like, there's no need to there's no need to reply. I just want you to be able to have this information. Also, if that's a repeated pattern with someone in particular, again, I know I keep saying this, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but that might be something that you do, again, kind of take offline and just say, hey, you know, I know there's been this pattern. Like, I appreciate when you acknowledge that you've received my emails and thank you. I really do. However, you know, I get a lot of emails and I have a pretty crowded inbox. And so, you know, there's no need to confirm that. It's okay. It's just an FYI anyways. That we're, again, just being kind of clear about that. If it's a pattern or something that we continue to experience that feels frustrating for us. And if you're the person who's sending the thank yous and no one has ever said anything to you, I mean, of course, it's important to take into consideration what we're talking about right now, which is that, like, it may crowd people's inboxes. But if they've never given you the feedback, then it may be something that's okay and that they don't mind. Or you can ask them. You could say, you know I like to say thank you. I like to confirm receipt of this just so that you know that I got it. But if that's, especially now as we're using a lot of email, if that becomes like overbearing or it's crowding your inbox, just let me know and I'll refrain from doing that. So I think on both the sender and the receiver's end, there's a lot of things that we can do in order to just get clear about whether or not that is working well, or if that is okay for people, or whether or not they would prefer something like that not to happen. I hope that helps. Okay, so I know we've gone well over time here, but I appreciate the questions and I'm happy to take the time to answer them. So before we officially end, I just want to check in and see if anyone else on the phone, even like through audio, not just the chat, has any kind of questions before we conclude. Okay, so just before I sign off, I'll just again remind you that my contact information, as you see on the screen, for those of you that are on the computer, will be sent, or that is my contact information, and the slides will be sent to everyone who attended. There's also some references that dig deeper into some of the things that I mentioned, especially around communication. So otherwise, I really do thank everyone for tuning in. I appreciate your participation. I hope there was something in the session that you found to be helpful. If you have additional or specific questions that you want to follow up with me on, please feel free to do so. And also, I'll just say that in addition to the slides, everyone will receive a link to a feedback survey, just so that you can give me your thoughts on how the session went. Anything that you can share in terms of feedback would be greatly appreciated. I will probably be doing more of these, and so it will really help me to understand the kinds of things that I should continue to do and the kinds of things that I should adjust for future sessions to better meet the expectations that people have. So with that, I will say thank you again and take care. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and stay safe out there.